What's up, everybody? It's guubums back with another comps video. I was recently rank 1, currently rank 2 after dropping a little bit, and I figured it'd be time to make a new comps video because there was a new patch. I think the meta has settled down a little bit, so it's pretty easy to kind of understand what the best comps are in the game right now. I think there haven't been, like with this patch specifically, there wasn't that many changes, so a lot of the comps that you guys will see today, if not all the comps that you guys will see today, are actually comps that you guys are probably at least somewhat familiar with. Either they were prevalent in the last patch or even a patch previous, and the patch just kind of made it so that these comps have either come back into meta or have stayed in meta. Maybe there's like a little bit of shift between of like what you would consider the S tier or the A tier and all that, but for the most part, I think the meta has pretty much stabilized at this point, and nothing like you guys will see will probably be too out of the ordinary. I was also going to make a follow-up video to this video, which will teach you about openers and item holders, stuff that will help you kind of like navigate through the early game, which will let you kind of get into these comps. I know a lot of people have been asking for that, so I've finally got around to recording kind of like a follow-up video to this. So that will probably release in a day or two's time from this video, and then you guys can look out for that. And also another thing is that, so these are going to be comps that are like pretty generic comps that you can find yourself playing like almost every single game or even every single game. I think there are a lot of niche comps that are really strong right now that you guys kind of have to be able to like either find an augment for or find an encounter for or find some sort of resource for to have access to. And I think those comps are worth talking about. I was probably going to make that into a separate video as well, so whenever that comes out, please look over that. Otherwise, this is just going to be for standard comps that you guys are just going to be playing for the most of your clan. So very first up, we have Zyra Reroll. This is a pretty standard comp nowadays, I think. People have really caught on to how strong it is. It's probably the strongest comp in the game right now, but because it only supports one player, for the most part, there are some kind of like exceptions to that, but because it supports only one player, I wouldn't say this is going to be the comp that you play the most, just because if someone else is playing it already, if someone else has a better spot than you do, then you're going to find it really difficult to kind of find the spot for it. Just because if your units get contested with this comp, it is predominantly a reroll comp. So yeah, just a little bit tough. Okay, so I think in my last video, or like sometimes maybe you guys will look at comp guides or like some of the resources online, you guys have been told to kind of reroll for this comp on 6. I think for the most part that's a really bad strategy. Most of the time you should not be rerolling for this comp on 6. I think bar some very specific circumstances, such as there's a portal or sorry an encounter that makes it so that you get to fit 7 units no matter the level that you're on. I think something like that makes you roll on 6 for this, but otherwise for the most part you're definitely rolling on 7 for this comp. I think where you might find yourself rolling on 6 is just to stabilize or to kind of like grab your pieces early, get your 2 stars online, and then slowly go 7 on either 4-1 or 4-2 depending on your spot, and then try to look for 3 stars on 7 or even sometimes on 8 pretty much once you get there. So what is this comp? So predominantly it's just 4 Ghostly plus Zyra. So it's normally these 6 units plus Morgana on 7. The reason why I have Garen here is because both Riven and Garen give a trait. So obviously Garen gives your Alawi 2 Warden and Riven gives your team 2 Bruiser. Both of these are super viable. It generally depends. You're going to just play whichever one you have upgraded for most of the game. I think where you'll find yourself playing Riven more than Garen is Riven actually has a much better scaling into the late game because she also comes with the Ultras tag. I think Warden for your Alawi is very important, but because it's difficult to go for Alawi 3, given that Alawi is one of the most popular and contested units in the meta right now, that you're much more likely to go for something like a Shen 3 or an Aatrox 3 as your main frontliner. So because of that, like Warden becomes slightly less valuable. That being said, Alawi at 2-star is by far the best frontline unit you can play in this comp. So I think most of the time you'll still find yourself stacking Alawi, which is why in those cases you are likely to play like a Garen, especially if he's upgraded, Garen 2, especially if you have him in the early game. So in those scenarios, just kind of like make sure you guys are finding kind of like where you can fit one versus the other. Like more on Riven is that like because she's an Ultrist, oftentimes late game you'll find yourself playing something like a Soraka and a Wukong. This gives 2 traits, gives you Heavenly, Ultrist, and Sage. This gives 3 traits with 3 units, really strong. You do need level 9 to get this, or sometimes you have a Tactician's Crown or an augment like New Recruit, so that you can fit this in. Otherwise, maybe you already have a Ghostly spat, something like a Morgana can come out. If you have a Wukong on 8, then you still get Ghostly. Mind you, in those cases, you'll have to find someone else to hold your Morello because Morgana is your best Morello holder. Both Zoe and, Zoe holds Morello quite well, but she's not going to be nearly as good as Morgana, so just bear that in mind. Otherwise, for the most part, that's just one of the cap out options, so it's not like worth giving it that much thought. Another one is just playing Ornn for your Shen. Sometimes you have, oftentimes you have Shen 3, so that's going to be really good for Behemoth. And then obviously it prints you an item as well. So say you're missing a frontline item, Ornn printing you an item is going to give you a lot of frontline that you otherwise wouldn't have. I personally recently played this where I just hit an Ornn 2 while rolling on 7, and I had a ghostly spat, so I didn't even play, I believe I didn't play Aatrox, and then I just played this for most of the game, and eventually I fit in 8 ghostly or something, or 6 ghostly or something like that. But pretty much those are kind of like the more niche options you'll find yourself playing when you play this comp, but for the most part, you should just be looking at a board that resembles something like this. So, talking about again, most of the time you do want to stack Zoe over Zyra. I think Zoe is the much stronger 3-star to go for. I know a lot of comp guides are telling you to go for Zyra 3 right now, but Zoe 3 is actually significantly stronger. Also, the reason why you'll find yourself stacking a Zyra as opposed to a Zoe is just because Zyra is a lot more accessible in the early game. So if you have like a Zyra 1 or a Zyra 2 on stage 2 or early stage 3, then oftentimes this unit will probably like be getting all your items because you're just trying to play strongest board until you have Zoe online. In those cases, say you have a second Zyra 2, it's much better to go for a Zyra 3 rather than a replacement, rather than to replace it, because you're leaving a lot of your cap space pretty much on the table instead of taking it in, just because at that point, like, you probably have 6 Zyras, so it's just better to go for Zyra 3. Obviously, in the case of you having a remover, or maybe you're not hitting that many Zyras and you're hitting a lot of Zoes, you have Zoe 3, then it's much better to itemize Zoe, just because at the end of the day, Zoe is stronger. So other than that, you're just going for, you know, Aatrox 3, Shen 3, Alawi 3 if you can hit it as a miracle, but I wouldn't think about it too much, just because she's too hard to find. But obviously, in some cases, say you're playing a Hui and you can print items, or you have a couple of Nikos here and there, and you already have some of these other 3 stars, then Alawi is perfectly fine to go for. Mind you that, once again, Alawi 3 is by far the strongest 3-star frontliner you can get here, but once again, it's unaccessible. Riven 3 is not something I would be too kind of like keen on going for. She's just in general a pretty weak unit when she doesn't get itemized, and the thing is, her items aren't really like the same as the other frontliners. They're much more like bruiser oriented. You're gonna see some stuff like BT Titans, maybe even a blue buff, and she just without Altruist, there's just no real reason to go for a Riven 3 in a comp like this. It's really bad for your enemy economy. It's really bad for your gold economy as well, and it's just not worth the headache of going for it. So I've seen a couple people go for Riven 3. Even if Riot or your shops give you a bunch of ribbons, generally speaking, it's not something that I think you should be looking out for too much, just because even though it might seem like you're high rolling, you get a bunch of ribbons, it's just like, because you can't itemize her in the way that she wants to be itemized, for the most part, she's not going to be a meaningful enough upgrade to your board. Okay, and before we get into the next comp, I just want to say, please like and subscribe to the video. Obviously, it helps me a lot. If you guys have any feedback or comments, please leave them down in the comment section below. You can check out the description for all my socials. And yeah, let's continue getting into the video. So next up, we have Duelist. I think at this point, I've actually made it pretty clear on how I think you guys should be playing Duelist. If you guys haven't watched my previous videos, I explained Duelist pretty in depth in those videos. But pretty much just kind of like a big recap, if you guys haven't seen those already, is that you are playing for a Lee Sin and Irelia cap out, and you're not really playing around that Volley Tristana 3 reroll anymore. I think in some cases, if you get given a lot of Volibears, a lot of Tristanas, it is worth itemizing and upgrading them, but because your main win con is to go for a Lee Sin 2 or Irelia 2, this is definitely not a comp you want to stay on level 7 for. I think you definitely want to be level 8 for this comp, just because without having Lee Sin and Irelia, most of the time you are just going to kind of like bleed a lot of HP. The exception obviously is if you have a lot of Volibears and a lot of Tristanas, even maybe before you make it to level 7 and level 8. So you have like 2 Tristana 2s at the mid game. It's a really, really strong board, even with like 2 or 4 Duelists. Then in those scenarios, I think maybe you can kind of like look for a Tristana 3, but I would still try to look for a Tristana 3 on level 8 as opposed to level 7. They did change the odds to make it so that the level 8 and level 7 odds for 3 costs are relatively similar. I believe one's 35 at level 7 and the other one's at 32 at level 8. So you're not really missing out much by going level 8, and obviously you're getting access to some of these 5 costs that you really want to be playing, which is Irelia and Wukong. I think otherwise a Rakan oftentimes sees play in in this board, just because, you know, without Wukong, you don't actually have Sage yet, so this Diana is not all that useful. Something you'll find yourself playing a lot is actually this Malphite. I don't believe I've actually talked about this too much in some of my other videos, but playing Malphite on level 8 is actually like a lot more important than I guess a lot of players really can understand, just because the way Heavenly works is that without having the 2 trade in, you don't actually get the AD for your Qiyana. And that 8 AD that you get from Heavenly, as soon as you put in a Malphite, is extremely important for your Qiyana, and or sorry, for your team, just because your entire team is doing physical damage. And the thing is, Malphite also gives 8 AD, or sorry, 8 MR and armor to your entire team, which is actually an insane stat that often goes underrated as well, just because Duelist gives damage reduction, and the way damage reduction interacts with armor and MR in this game is really complementary, just because they multiply off each other. So the effective HP that you get for having both high armor and MR unit with stacked with a lot of damage reduction is just it's a lot more effective HP than you can get for the most part. That's why you, even though like for example a Nico is a higher cost unit than Malphite, also probably provides more as a single unit standalone, you'll still find a lot of more people playing Malphite, partially just because he's cheap. Obviously, it costs 3 gold less than Nico, arguably 4, but 3 gold less than a Nico, and just because the armor and MR ends up being a lot better for your team than the HP does. And yeah, so that's you should definitely be holding Malphites in the early game. Like I think most of the time when you're playing this comp, one of the other reasons why Malphite ends up being really good is just because you already have a Malphite 2 from the mid game. Oftentimes if you're playing around say a Qiyana or like a Darius in the early game, it's really easy to fit Malphite because one, obviously it gives you Heavenly with Qiyana, but even if you're playing around a Yorick, for example, then you have Umbral, Heavenly, and Duelist. So obviously these 4 units in the early game, which represents one of the strongest openers, which is a little bit of a teaser for, as I mentioned in the next video, but this is one of the strongest openers in the game. You'll find that Malphite just really slots in really easily into kind of like a build like that. And yeah, just having your earlier game Malphite is actually pretty important, because being able to access your level 8 board without like having to spend extra gold looking for specific units is a lot more beneficial than I think most people kind of like really think about. But yeah, it is worth thinking about. As for augments with this comp, you know, once again, I've kind of talked about all these to death, so there's not going to be too much new stuff here. Keepers, duels +1, extended duel, any combat augments, gifts on the fallen, you know, tons of stats specifically with this comp actually becomes really strong once you get Aurelia, because Aurelia, if you don't know how she works, is that she has to auto attack 8 times to get her cast off. The way tons of stats works is that even though it gives 4 mana to all your other units, the way it works with Aurelia specifically is that she actually starts with 4 stacks of her ulti right away, meaning that she ults in half the time. The reason why that's really beneficial is just because the sooner you do damage, with most comps, pretty much the more impactful the damage is. So that those 4 extra auto attacks kind of actually go a long way to her overall output of DPS in a fight, just because most of the time they'll probably just be like a lot of upfront damage, as well as netting her an extra ult by the time the fight ends. So yeah, this is a pretty straightforward comp. I think if you guys have been playing this already, you guys probably already know how strong it is. It's not quite as strong after some of the nerfs to this comp, but it's still probably the strongest comp in the game outside of this comp. But because this comp is playable every single game, I would say if you guys are looking to climb, this is definitely the comp you guys should be angling the most. It's also very easy to pilot. So purely for LP, if this is like something you're interested in, I'm sure a lot of you guys are, then this is going to be the comp for you. Go ahead and play more Duelists. Not too much has changed, so if you guys were doing well with Duelists before, you guys will probably continue to do well with Duelists now. Okay, next up we have Faded Dryad. This comp, once again, I talked about in the previous video, but maybe like I can add a couple more tips and pointers to this video that you guys weren't all that familiar with in the previous video. This comp, once again, is quite straightforward. I think most of the time you're going to be playing this comp from a blue Nasher start or like a tier Nasher start. Oftentimes you have the faded units in the early game, Ahri, Yasuo, and Kindred. The thing with this comp is that it's actually not that strong in the early game when you have the faded opener, but because the comp becomes really strong pretty much as soon as you hit 1 Ornn and 1 Syndra, this comp is still probably among one of the top tiers in the meta. They actually just recently gave Syndra a pretty sizable buff. I think if you look at the patch notes, it's actually unclear whether or not it's a buff or a nerf, but Mortdog has confirmed that it is a buff. And if you look at kind of like the stats for the units, as well as like pretty much like analyzing how the unit's performing, Syndra seems to be doing significantly better across the board, both within this comp and within some of the other comps you might find her being played in, such as like Vertical Arcanist. Once again, that's a more niche comp, so it's not really something that like I would think it's worth mentioning in a video like this, but Syndra seems to be doing better across the board. So this comp actually got probably a slight to sizable buff as of the most recent patch, making it really, really strong. Something that you guys will notice is that with these top 3 comps, there's actually a little bit of a matchup triangle, just because Syndra does really, really poorly into Ghostly, but they actually both do really well into Duelist, and this Duelist is still going to be probably the most popular comp that you're running into. So both of these comps having a positive matchup into Duelist actually lend a lot of pretty much go a long way for making this comp more powerful than you might be familiar with. So this comp is pretty simple. It abuses +1s pretty well, and the thing is, this comp actually has 2 makeable spats, and that's pretty important. Both Dryad spat and Faded spat are makeable. So obviously, if you get dropped a spatula as opposed to getting dropped, like I say, a tome or like an augment that might give you a spat, this gives you kind of 2 outs to play for. I'd say in general, Faded spat is significantly harder to build because this is an AP comp, and AP comps generally just are really, really rod starved. So having said that, like you won't have that many rods to like afford being able to make a Faded spat out of, because you really need to get your spark, and you really need to get probably a rod item on Syndra or even Kindred to really kind of get this comp online. So most of the time you should be looking for a Dryad spat. Fortunately for us, the Dryad spat ends up actually being significantly stronger than the Faded spat for most of the game, just because it gives you access to 6 Dryad as soon as you have a Zyra, but it also allows you to drop Gnar in the mid game. So something like this, obviously you're playing 4 Dryad, and you can play any random unit. Actually, my favorite unit to play is double Ornn. I think I've noticed a lot of people just don't do this. Even if you have 2 Ornn 1s or an Ornn 2 and an Ornn 1, this is perfectly acceptable. Ornn 1 will always cast with 4 Dryad and 2 Behemoth, and you're almost always just getting an item printed on someone, as well as like I believe it's a 500 shield. It's actually a 300 shield. They nerfed it. It's 500 at 2-star with a couple Dryad, like 2 or 4 Dryad in. So that's kind of like where that came from. Oh, actually no, I'm wrong. I mean, it's pretty much all you really need to know is that it's a sizable shield, and that shield often ends up obviously eating enough damage, so the effective HP that you get from it is really, really powerful. Obviously, most of the time you will not have set, so in those cases you're just probably playing a Yasuo. This is pretty strong to begin with. If you have a Faded spat, feel free to drop Yasuo. Feel free to play 7 Faded. Both are pretty viable. Something I would like to kind of note about this comp is that I've noticed a lot of lower elo players are kind of like too tunnel vision on something like a 7 Faded. I think for the most part, you should be trying to avoid playing Aphelios and Yasuo as much as possible, just because the unit quality of these units is extremely, extremely low, and they don't provide that much to your team, past like obviously giving you the trait. And the thing is, we're pairing Syndra and Ahri, which is obviously giving you damage and ability power, but neither of these units actually use damage and ability power all that well. So, and they're not really providing that much frontline. Obviously, Yasuo is a frontline unit, but mind you, once we reach level 8 and level 9, and sometimes even level 10, Yasuo is a 1-cost unit. So there's obviously there's going to be a lot of other options that you can play over it. Most notably, I think the strongest version is double Azir, double Ornn. I've seen a lot of people play Annie with this comp. Annie has some value in that she gives 2 Invoker, but if you've actually ever read 2 Invoker, you would know that 2 Invoker is pretty much useless on all the units here, except say for Azir. So I wouldn't, like, 2 Invoker is not something I'd be super kind of keen on playing. I think where you might find Annie is very useful is against other melee comps, because the way Annie casts is that she casts and then stuns every unit around her. So if you're playing against, for example, a Duelist player, then playing an Annie is a lot more valuable, and it has nothing to do with the fact that she's an Invoker, but more so to do with the fact that that's just how her ult is provides value to your team. Annie as well, without items, it tends to be pretty weak, and because we're going to predominantly be stacking an Ornn, Annie's not something that we're going to just have the item economy to kind of itemize. So in those cases, it just ends up happening that Annie's not that strong. I'd much rather play 2 Azirs, even if one's a 2-star and one's a 1-star, or if both of them are 1-star. I'd much rather play 2 Azirs and 2 Ornns. They're just getting a lot more stats from your traits that you already have active. Most of the time, once again, you already have 4 Dryad, so both Azirs benefit from 4 Dryad, right? So it's not like you're not losing anything for playing an Azir, so much as like, I mean, you're just really not losing anything, and obviously this year's a massive spike for the sport, so is Ornn, so like, why wouldn't you play 2 of them if you can, right? Finally, I think I mentioned in the last video, but something really important that I find even challenger players are doing, a really important mistake rather that I find even challenger players are making, is that they're trying to give Ornn items to Set. Well, they're not trying, rather they're pretty much prioritizing the lift value of Set's passive, where he kind of like squats the 2 fucking champs next to it to gain AD. I don't know. It's not all that useful. Obviously, Set, given enough time, actually stacks a lot of AD, so it becomes pretty strong, But the thing is, you're not losing that much value by, like, say for example, putting Set next to a Thresh and a Rek'Sai, because they also have pretty high HP. The important part about this is that Ornn is giving the tank item to Thresh rather than giving a damage item to Set. Set's recommended items are all damage based. You're going to see Guardbreaker, you're going to see Hodge, Titans. All these items, when they're printed by Ornn to give to your set, are just not that valuable. And you'd much rather have a tank item printed to Thresh just because it gives your board a lot more power during the fight. And pretty much this is just a mistake I see like so many people making, and it's just so not worth it. And I think immediately, as soon as you literally just one swap on your board every single game, and you're just going to get a lot more out of this comp than you probably otherwise would be. Just make sure otherwise that Kindred and Syndra are on the same side with your Spark and your Sunfire, just because you generally want these two to be focusing down the same unit, and you'll need your Spark and Sunfire to do that as well, so Ornn ends up being on the same side. Azir tends to be in the middle just because he draws kind of like a line across the enemy team, ends up doing more AoE that way. Obviously it's kind of dropping the soldier in the middle of the front line as well, so it ends up being more effective HP for your board. But yeah, this comp is once again relatively straightforward, so if you guys have been playing this comp so far, then you guys can probably continue to play this comp and do fine. Next up, we have a classic for the set. It's Trickshot Kai'Sa. She's back. They actually buffed Trickshot's back. They did not revert the Galio and the Sylas nerfs. I think Sylas probably should have stuck, but it doesn't really make sense that Galio got nerfed. So if you guys weren't kind of seeing too much of this comp in the previous patch, that's probably going to be why. But the thing is, they buffed Trickshot back after they kind of like nerfed it for no reason as well. Obviously, once again, I don't work at Riot. I don't know, some of the changes they make don't always make sense. But this comp is back in the meta, and I think it's actually really strong. I've been playing it a little bit, not on my main. I've been playing on a Smurf, but still challenger lobbies, so for the most part it's still, to me, it seems really strong. I think it has a couple bad matchups, most predominantly into, say, like Ashe, which I'll talk about a little bit later. It has a couple bad matchups, but for the most part, this is like a pretty good standard comp to play. I think it's really easy to get into. You're just building Kai'Sa items, any tank items will do, and then you just itemize either Sylas or Galio. If you guys have been kind of like following the channel for a while, you guys will know that this was probably my most played, or is my most played in the previous patches, so I've already talked about this comp a lot. I think one thing that you guys should probably be a little bit wary of is that, like, there's a lot of clump punish in the game right now between Morgana, Lillia, and Nautilus, that I would position your backline kind of like this rather than something like this, just because, yes, you can get more attack speed on, say, like a Zyra or a Kai'Sa between Sivir and Kayle, but by clumping like this, obviously one Morgana ult and all of your backliners are getting hit, right? And then two Morgana ults and all your backliners are dead, and we don't want that. So we want to position something like this, maybe even like something like this, just to like stay as spread out as far as possible. I think most of the time you do want to just greed a little bit of this attack speed, whether it be on Zyra or whether it be on Kai'Sa. I think it's up to you, but you do want to greed a little bit, but you don't want to pretty much immediately lose the fight at like 2 seconds in just because your entire team got ulted, right? If you position something like this, then you're going to see Morgana ults this hex a lot more often, right? And by ulting this hex, obviously it's hitting your frontliners. It's a lot less impactful than hitting your backliners, so that is something to look out for. But otherwise, yeah, this comp is pretty straightforward. I think you guys have seen this comp a million times before. Augments, pretty generic. Any combat augment will do. Combat caster, Martyr is really strong. I think the Trickshot specific augment, I believe it's called Lucky Ricochet, is really strong, just because it gives you that one extra ricochet that you might be able to use to snipe an enemy backliner. Obviously, before you have Zyra, then you're going to be playing Bard most of the time, and at level 9, most of the time you're going to be playing Udyr just to get a tattoo. A lot of the tattoos fit well on Zyra and Kai'Sa, but obviously some of them will fit well on your frontliner as well. Tattoo of Force is actually my personal kind of like dark horse. Just because a lot of people don't kind of like view it as a strong tattoo, but placed on Sylas, it ends up being really strong. So Tattoo of Force, in my opinion, is actually really strong. But otherwise, just generic Bombardment, Toxin, all those can go on either Zyra or Kai'Sa, depending on which one you already have itemized. And yeah, it's pretty straightforward from there. I think, as per usual, you shouldn't be like turbo greeting this 4 bruiser trait. Say you have an Ornn 2 on your roll down, then it's perfectly acceptable to drop one of these bruisers for an Ornn, especially because it sets you up really well for playing around Udyr. Another thing is that, say your tattoo is really good, and it like say you need it for like a 3rd item on Kai'Sa or a 3rd item on Zyra, or once again that Force tattoo, then you can look to actually play Jax Nautilus. And Jax Nautilus plus Aatrox plus any 1 bruiser will give you 3 Ink Shadow on level 8, and this is another pretty strong setup that I would definitely look for. some of the time, but obviously the default ways to play this is to play 4 Berserk. Okay, next up we have Lillia Morgana. I think this comp is a little bit strange because it's not entirely clear how strong this is, but I do think it's quite strong. The stats would suggest that this is quite a strong comp as well. Lillia, I think, as a unit is really, really strong now. After a couple patches ago, it got buffed. So I'd say play this comp, but it is really, really expensive. And it's also really, really item hungry. So just kind of like bear that in mind before you kind of opt into playing this comp. But that being said, it's pretty straightforward. So I think the main issue I see a lot of players making, once again, even at the challenger level, is they over prioritize Morgana. I think it's actually really easy to just straight up drop Morgana out of your board when you're playing this comp, and just like say for a Hui or like even a different backline carry. But I see a lot of people like, oh, they have like a Morgana and they think like, oh, I better start stacking her. The thing is, Morgana is a really, really bad main carry, but she provides a lot of value as an off carry just because her traits are really strong, as well as being probably the best Morello spreader in the game, bar some of the 5 costs, right? So you really do want to be itemizing Lillia, even if you have Lillia 1 and a Morgana 2, just because Lillia provides a single target that you otherwise wouldn't have if you play this comp. And actually, you'll find if you are stacking Morgana and have no Lillia items when playing this comp, you're just gonna leave a lot of like units at like 1 HP, and you're not gonna be able to kill them. Say for example, you're fighting against a Lee Sin, even a Lee Sin 1, Morgana 2 will almost never kill a Lee Sin 1, whereas like even a Lillia 1 gives you a significantly higher chance at killing a Lee Sin and winning the fight. And even stuff like, say like a Declaw Alawi, if you have a Declaw Alawi, Morgana will literally never kill a Declaw Alawi. It's just not possible. And yeah, so that's one of the major mistakes I see most people playing with the comp. I'd say another one is like, it doesn't really matter which frontliner you stack, and this Janna Diana package that most people play is also not really that important. I think even though you lose Dragon Lord, immediately as soon as you find an Azir, you're playing Azir over Janna. It doesn't matter that you lose Dragon Lord. This Diana obviously can go as well. At that point, it's just 2 Sage. Obviously Wukong goes in and Soraka goes in, but like these are obviously like there's just so many options to play with this comp. I think for the most part, this is going to be your core. It's like a 5-unit core rather than like a 7 or 8-unit core. And you're just filling out this kind of like core with anything else you can find. Soraka ends up being pretty good just because it gives us Heavenly and it gives you a little bit of AP. Rakan ends up being pretty good just because it gives you Altruist in this case. And then once again, we have Dragon Lord, so we're going to be playing something like a Janna. And the thing is, Invoker in this comp actually ends up mattering because most of the time you can't build blue buff in this comp. So another AP comp, because this is another AP comp, it ends up being really, really item starved as well. So it's like you can't really build something like a blue buff. For those of you guys who don't know, blue buff and Shojin on Lillia actually kind of matter depending on the level of Invoker you're playing. So if you're playing 0 or 4 Invoker, blue buff is always better than Shojin. But if you're playing exactly 2 Invoker, then Shojin's always better than blue buff. And the reason for that is because Lillia is a 50 mana unit. 2 Invoker essentially drops her down to a 45 mana unit. It's a good way of approximating it. At least it drops it down to a 45 mana unit, and a 45 mana unit would significantly prefer Shojin over blue buff just because it's 3 autos cast versus 4 autos cast. So yeah, you generally want to be building Shojin because you end up in 2 Invoker a lot. But in the case that you end up in 4 Invoker, then blue buff ends up being better. So yeah, you do want to be playing 2 Invoker. Janna or Azir are the kind of like the standard ones. I would say a Loon is quite playable in the case that you don't have, say, a Spark or a Shiv, just because she reduces MR, she shreds MR. Very, very important not to be overstated, just because without Shred, most of the time, once again, you're going to suffer from having a lack of single target damage. So Loon obviously gives you a lot of ways to get around that. That being said, she's not going to be the most reliable, so I would still be looking to build a Shiv or a Spark wherever I can. Once again, these requires Rod and Tears, so the item economy ends up being really scuffed. But yeah, Lillia best in slot, pretty standard. Shojin, Nashor's Deathcap, JG. Morello works fine on either of them, but because Morgana is such a good Morello spreader, that most of the time you end up putting the Morello Morgana and then look for a real kind of like more selfish item on Lillia. But yeah, and then you just have generic tank items on Alawi or Nautilus. Doesn't matter which one gets them, but most of the time, if you don't have Nautilus 2, they should go on Alawi. Try not to put them on Nico. Nico ends up being not a very good tank in the late game, but yeah, this comp does have some options. I think it's a little bit tougher to play than some of the other comps I mentioned, but it is a very powerful comp, and it's one of the 2 main AP comps in the meta right now. So I would play it when you get the spot for it, but I wouldn't be kind of like hard forcing this comp or like angling this comp that much if you guys aren't already familiar with it. Finally, we have Ashe Sniper Warden. This comp is super easy. But interestingly enough, okay, it's super easy, but it's also like kind of hard to like play perfectly, just because even at the challenger level, you'll find that like a lot of people don't have that much success with it. Me personally, and my group of players that I study with and that I kind of play with a lot, talk to a lot, we don't actually do that well with Ashe. But there are a lot of players, for example, like Dish Soap. You know, if you guys don't know who Dish Soap is, you guys probably should, just because he's always rank 1. Obviously, one of the best players in North America. He plays this comp very, very well, and often does very, very well with this comp. But you know, I'll try my best to kind of explain some of the ideas you want to be thinking about when you're playing this comp. So the tankiest frontliner you have is Amumu, just because it has both Porcelain and Warden. So just generally speaking, that's going to be the one you itemize. Nautilus gets itemized with stuff like Vow and Adaptive just to help him cast, but it's a little bit strange to use Nautilus as a main tank because he's just not tanky enough to ult twice most of the time. And even something just like one single Vow allows him to sometimes ult twice, which obviously generates a lot of value. But otherwise, Amumu is just going to be a lot more effective HP on your board. After Amumu, you can stack Alawi. Obviously, if you as soon as you get set 2, then set 2 should start obviously getting items. You just play Syndra on 9, and you pair Filio set, and you're off to the races. Obviously, this gives you 3 faded. But yeah, this comp is like, and otherwise you're just like looking for Ashe items. I think you go Rageblade, Gunblade, IE ideally, and you put Last Whisper or an Even Shroud on someone else. This is like something that I personally like doing, not building Last Whisper on Ashe. Obviously, if you have Last Whisper on Ashe, it's just like it's perfectly acceptable. It's not something that like I would think about not building. I know someone in the comments is gonna say, okay, Aphelios shreds armor, so why are you building Last Whisper? As it turns out, Last Whisper is still better. Don't ask that, pretty much. If you have Last Whisper, build Last Whisper, but at the same time, just getting a form of shred anywhere is going to be really important. That being said, because Aphelios doesn't have Sunder, or sorry, does have Sunder, it makes it so that like this comp doesn't auto lose the game when you don't have, say, a Last Whisper or an Even Shroud. And that's a little bit helpful, but for the most part, you still should definitely be looking for Last Whisper or Even Shroud somewhere. And then yeah, this comp is really straightforward. You're playing 4 Warden and 4 Sniper on 8. If you have a Sniper +1, which allows you to play 6 Sniper, then you play Kog'Maw and you Sniper one of these guys on 9. Until 9, you're probably just gonna be playing something like this on 8, assuming you have a Sniper emblem somewhere. But yeah, this comp is really straightforward. I don't think there's like too many nuances on like exactly how to play it, but it's just managing your mid game and like saving HP, stuff like that. Managing your item slams is going to be a little bit important for this comp. As for the augments, you're just looking for long shot and sniper crown. Once again, other than those, any generic combat augment will do. Obviously, some econ augments are fine as well if you just need to get to this. This is a really good top 4 comp for the most part, so I'd say play this if you have the spot for it, but obviously if you don't, then there's a lot of other different stuff you can play in the meta, so yeah, and that's pretty much the comp, and I guess that's pretty much the video. As always, if you guys like the video, please leave a like and subscribe to the channel. It really helps out. Once again, if you guys have any feedback, just leave it down in the comments below. And yeah, until next time, or until the next video, the follow-up video to this, yeah, peace.